Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Ernst Roots. In an earlier episode of the Pioneer Podcast, I had a fascinating conversation with my friend David Azerrad in Washington, D.C. about identity and ideology. This was just after the National Conservatism Conference where we were both speakers, and so our conversation focused on some of the topics that the two of us discussed at the conference. During that conversation, we spoke, among others, about the difference between being right-wing and being conservative. Two things that really stood out to me about this discussion was firstly, that we as Afrikaners attach much more weight to the difference between being conservative and right-wing, while many of our friends in Europe and America see the two terms as almost synonymous. And secondly, that on the scale between being right-wing and being conservative, we as Afrikaners are much more prone to describe ourselves as conservative, while often having a negative connotation to the idea of being right-wing. And so I want to use this episode to talk to you about what it means to be conservative, why we are conservative, and why you should be too. Rest assured, we will not get too entangled in abstract or abstruse philosophy. This podcast is not written for philosophers, but for ordinary people who understand that there is a difference between good and evil, who appreciate beauty, and who value truth and freedom. Now, we cannot talk about what it means to be conservative without touching on some philosophical themes. If, however, at any point in this discussion you feel as if you are not following me, just hold on for a few seconds, as I will include practical examples to illustrate every point and argument as we go along. So let me start by saying that the great conservative thinker of our time, Roger Scruton, was correct in saying that it's wrong to think of conservatism as a political ideology. Now, saying this goes against the grain of what most political science textbooks teach about conservatism. These textbooks, which are often written by leftist professors that are antagonistic toward conservatism, tend to describe conservatism as merely one item to choose from on the menu of political ideologies. Why is it wrong to think of conservatism as an ideology? Well, the easy answer is that at its core, conservatism doesn't comply with the definition of what constitutes an ideology. The problem, however, in making a claim like this is that political scientists and philosophers don't agree on how to define the concept of an ideology. But even though we can't agree on how to technically define it, we are pretty much in agreement on what it means. Regardless of the different ways in which you can try to define it, an ideology is, at its core, a set of ideas or a theory that tells us how we ought to structure society to create a better world. What do we need more of, and what do we need less of in order to change things? This is important because all ideologies proclaim that there is a difference between how things are and how things ought to be, and that we ought to implement certain ideas, call it policies if you want, to take us down the path from how things are to how things ought to be. Well, let me give you a few examples. Marxism purports that the world would be a better place if every person were to work according to their abilities and receive according to their needs. This is a theory that tells us that there are some things fundamentally wrong with the world, and the most important thing that is wrong with the world is inequality between people. It then proclaims that this fundamental characteristic of the world, the fact of inequality, can be changed. In other words, we can go from how the world actually is to how the world ought to be if only we were to implement the theory of Marxism through a set of political and economic policies. It assumes that once the world has been changed, according to this theory, the world would be a better place. Liberalism purports that the world would be a better place if we were to prioritize individual choice by liberating the individual from the restrictions placed upon it by society, the community, and the groups to which they belong. Or, put differently, by prioritizing the right of the individual to make their own decisions over the pressures and restrictions placed upon individuals by the communities of which they form part. This is a theory that tells us that there are some things fundamentally wrong with the world, and the most important thing that is wrong with the world is that people tend to place restrictions on each other when they form groups, leading to a situation where the individual is then prevented from doing certain things that they want to do, or forced to do certain things that they do not want to do. It proclaims that this fundamental characteristic of the world, the fact of communal association and the suppression of the individual, you might call it, that sprouts from this, can be changed if only we were to implement the theory of liberal individualism through a set of political and economic policies. It assumes that once the good, that is individual liberty and individual choice, has been placed at the top of the hierarchy of things that we regard as good, the world would be a better place. And we can do the same exercise with every other ideology. Now, at this point, you might say, wait a minute, how is this not applicable to conservatism? Do conservatives not see something wrong with the world? Do conservatives not have a theory? Do conservatives not promote certain policy positions? Do conservatives not believe that the world would be a better place if their ideas were to be implemented? Well, the answer to all of these questions is yes, they do, but in a fundamentally different way. The difference between all these ideologies and the conservative idea is that conservatives do not see a big difference between how things are and how things ought to be, at least as far as our ability to change things is concerned. We might say that believing that there is a difference between how things are and how things ought to be is the most basic defining feature of an ideology, while on the other hand, accepting that things are a certain way and that the best we can do is to live in harmony with things as they are, is the most basic defining feature of the conservative idea. If this confuses you, or if you think that you have lost me, rest assured, I'm pretty sure you haven't. Let me explain what I mean, and then I will get to some examples. When I speak about the difference between how things are and how things ought to be, I'm not referring to the consequences of political and economic policies. I'm not referring to everything that is wrong with the government or life under the modern state. In other words, I'm not referring to things like crime statistics, levels of unemployment, service delivery problems, the fact that we don't trust the government, and so forth. So I'm not talking about the consequences of bad government policy on the one hand, but also, and very importantly, I'm not referring to sin and evil deeds committed by bad people. I will get back to these things a bit later. What I am referring to is the nature of things and the consequences that naturally flow from the way things are. Proponents of every ideology would be quick to point out that what is wrong with the world is the result of some enforced ideas of some other ideology. What makes conservatism different is that it believes that what is wrong with the world is not simply the ideas of some other ideology, but of ideology itself. It doesn't see other ideologies as the problem, it sees ideology as the problem. Conservatives accept that people are communal creatures who naturally want to become part of and contribute to something that is bigger than their individualistic selves. That people have the capacity to do good, especially when good people work together in the promotion of the common good, but also that people are sinful by nature with the capacity to do evil, especially when they become disengaged from their communities and when they lose track of what is good. That people will always outperform each other depending on the activities they are engaged with. That some people will generally perform better, while it is also true that no one is able to outperform everyone in everything due to the fact that people have unique skill sets and interests and personalities. That everything in the universe, whether we are talking about human beings, plants, animals, planets, and everything in between, has a particular nature. That people, and things for that matter, cannot be perfected as some ideologues would claim. In other words, that in as far as we do not like or agree with the above-mentioned points, it is not within the ambit of our abilities to change these basic facts of life. This is because conservatism accepts things as they are, because it accepts that we cannot change the nature of things. Religiously speaking, it accepts that God created the universe, the earth, and the people that inhabit the earth in a particular way and for a particular purpose. And even though we don't understand all of this, we accept that the good life implies living in harmony with these facts of life, as opposed to trying to change them. This is why conservatives believe that only pain and destruction can follow from attempts to change such things, from waging war on the nature of things, from trying to fundamentally change the way people instinctively are, or from trying to conquer nature, as they say, which is another way of saying to place ourselves at the top of the order of things to such an extent that we gain the power to fundamentally change the nature of things. And herein lies the most important difference between conservative philosophy and every other strand of philosophy. Conservative philosophy seeks to discover truths as they are, to understand things as they are, to make sense of the world in which we live, and then to promote the good or the good life within the ambit of these things. This is because conservatism holds that the good, that is, living the good life by pursuing what is good, lies in living in harmony with nature. And when I say living in harmony with nature, I don't mean living off the land or surviving in the bush. I simply mean living in harmony with the nature of things. Ideological philosophy, on the other hand, and especially modern philosophies, seek not merely to know and to understand. It seeks not to live in harmony with how things are, but to change the nature of things in order to achieve a better world. A better world than the one we have. It aims to achieve this by developing theories on how to create a better world, how to overcome the nature of things, how to bridge the gap between how things are and how things ought to be, and then enforcing the prescriptions put forth by these theories, usually through the state. Think, for example, of the ways in which socialists seek to redistribute property through the power of the state. How environmentalists seek to implement laws to drastically regulate things like travel and farming and so forth. How transgender ideologues seek to prosecute those who misgender them. And how many liberals believe that non-Western and especially third world countries would become better if they were to reject their own way of doing things and accept the Western and the liberal way of thinking through means like liberal democracy and individual human rights. Only for all of them to discover that it doesn't work. That all of these attempts to use the state to change the way things are only create more friction without ever achieving the desired outcome. The ancient Greek, Roman, and Christian philosophers understood that people are both communal animals, that we naturally form communities, and that our lives are given meaning by the communities that we belong to, and also that we have individual agency, that we are each blessed with a unique personality and a unique set of skills and talents. And so the classical Western conclusion, which we might also describe as the conservative conclusion, is that it is our task to find harmony between our natural desire to make our own decisions and our natural desire to seek fulfillment through our communities. Now remember, the conservative approach is first and foremost to understand things as they are. And so the conservative conclusion on what constitutes freedom is that we ought to find a balance between freedom for the individual as a citizen of the community and freedom for the community as an association or a collective with its own distinct identity. Hypothetically, when a conservative walks through a forest, he observes that there are trees, that every tree is unique, but also that the trees collectively constitute a forest. The conservative recognizes that the forest is given meaning through the trees that form part of the forest, and that the trees are given meaning through the forest to which they belong. And so uprooting the tree and planting it in some desolate place would require tearing it out of the forest that gives it meaning, and also by robbing the forest of an important part that contributes to making the forest what it is. Modern ideologies tend not to appreciate this balance. The socialist sees individual agency and the inequality that results from individual freedom as a threat. And so the socialist would only recognize the group while completely disregarding the individuals that form part of the group. It sees the forest, but it doesn't recognize the trees. And the fact that the forest is what it is as a result of the collective of unique contributions made by each and every individual tree. The liberal individualist, on the other hand, sees communal identity as a threat to individual choice, because belonging to a group implies that you have certain responsibilities. It implies peer pressure, and it implies negative social consequences if the individual doesn't respect the customs and traditions of the group. And so the liberal tends to see the group, the natural consequences of the proclivity of people to associate in groups, as a threat to the individual, because it values individual freedom above all else. The liberal sees the group and group identity as a threat to the individual, which is why we often hear liberal thinkers say things such as, "I hate groupthink," and also why liberal thinkers tend to define wokeness as a form of identity politics, as if all politics rooted in identity is by definition bad and contemptible, evidently not recognizing that politics is by nature rooted in identity. In other words, the liberal recognizes the trees but disregards the forest. And so, in a forest, when trees grow close to each other, they tend to limit each other's freedom. Some smaller trees also grow faster under the shadows of big trees, and some trees die when they don't get enough sun. Now, this forest dynamic sounds extremely complicated, and in many ways it is. But the wonderful thing about nature is that every small entity that forms part of the forest naturally finds its own place. You don't need to regulate a forest into prosperity. It's simply a matter of organic growth. The point is that individual agency naturally leads to the creation and fostering of groups, while group dynamics naturally lead to certain restrictions placed on individuals. This is simply a fact of life. And it is only an ideologue that would have the audacity and the inflated sense of self-capacity to seek to change this. I would venture to suggest that the most important philosophical claim ever made was Aristotle's conclusion that man is by nature a political animal. He concluded such because this was what his observations led him to conclude, and this is what he has discovered about human nature. Not because he has constructed a theory that concludes that people would have to do this in order to create a better world, but he does say that the world would be worse off, that people would be less happy, and that there would be more pain and sorrow if we don't appreciate and live in harmony with this fact of nature. This statement, that man is by nature a political animal, is in many ways the essence of what it means to be conservative. But we have to understand what Aristotle meant when he said this. This was long before the modern state as we have it today. And so when he concluded that man is by nature a political animal, Aristotle wasn't referring to politics as we understand it today. He was referring to the polis. Now, the word polis is usually translated into modern English to mean city-state, the city-state, which is a fairly good translation, but this doesn't quite capture the actual meaning of the word. And as a result, it's easy to lose the depth that is to be found in Aristotle's statement. The polis was not just a city, as we know cities today. It was the natural consequence of the fact that people associate with each other on the basis of things on which they agree and things that they appreciate and wish to preserve, particularly culture and tradition. It's a community that cherishes commonality, as opposed to the modern tendency in which we are told to shun commonality and replace it with diversity. A community that saw the things that people have in common with one another as the source of their strength. And Aristotle's observation was that it's perfectly natural for people to want to live in a community like this. This is because people who share the same culture and tradition naturally associate with one another. But also, when people associate, they tend to develop, grow, and nurture their cultures and traditions even further. This implies that culture is not static, but dynamic. And herein lies the natural cycle of culture, or the culture cycle, we can call it. The culture cycle is the natural process where people shape and are shaped by their cultures and traditions through mutual association, where people associate based on a shared culture, and where that culture is then nurtured and involved through their continued interaction. This is not to say that other cultures and other traditions are wrong, merely that people tend to want to spend time with people who celebrate the same things as them, who have the same rituals, ceremonies, traditions, language, religion, and so forth. But the world has gotten to a place where simply recognizing this has become controversial, because modern ideologies seek to reject and change this fact of nature. Once again, underlining the conclusion that conservatism is by nature anti-ideological. In a certain sense, this understanding of what it means to be a human being was the core of the great debate between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. The debate between these two celebrated thinkers was sparked by the French Revolution, which very quickly led to a debate about how things are and how to make sense of the world. Burke's conclusion and prediction was that the French Revolution would lead to a whole-scale destruction and would not create the liberty or the equality it proclaims to champion, because the ideologies that underpinned the French Revolution were detached from reality, detached from the nature of things. It sought to liberate mankind by freeing the individual from natural political things such as authority, responsibility, tradition, and so forth. While in Burke's analysis, this was impossible because the only way in which this could be achieved was to change the nature of things, to change human nature, and it is not within the ambit of our capabilities to change such things. Paine, on the other hand, argued that Burke was quick to call on history and historical facts like tradition. He remarked that Burke was correct to take his argument back to how things were in the beginning, but in Paine's analysis, Burke didn't go back far enough. Paine's conclusion was that before there were groups, before people started associating, before they developed cultures and traditions and a sense of communal authority, before the polis and the ancient Greeks, they were individuals. And the liberal conception of freedom implies going back to the very beginning by recognizing that people were individuals before they were anything else. Burke's rebuttal to this was that this type of thinking is too abstract, because in arguing as such, Paine was attempting to detach the individual from the nature of the individual. In other words, we might argue through abstract reasoning that we were individuals before we were anything else, but this is just a denial of the fact that ingrained within our individuality is a proclivity to associate with others on the basis of communal identity and a desire to protect and to preserve things that we value, especially within the context of our communities. And so looking back today, we can say that Burke was correct in his analysis of the French Revolution, the flaws in the ideologies that underpinned it, and also in his prediction that the revolution would fail. But we can take the argument further by saying that, in a very fundamental way, the mistake that Thomas Paine made, which led to his detaching of the individual from the community, was the same mistake that Karl Marx made and all the other inventors of political ideologies made. It was to deny the essence of how things are. By identifying a problem in the world without recognizing that at its core, the problem that they have identified is a natural consequence of the nature of things. As a result of which, they developed theories on how to create a better world through the implementation of political and economic theories to take us from how things are to how things ought to be. This is a fundamental rejection of the Western tradition, because the essence of Western tradition has always been to recognize and to seek to understand and appreciate the nature of things. This is why Western tradition, whether we are talking about the ancient Greeks, Romans, the early Christians, or the great thinkers of the Middle Ages, holds the belief that harmony, justice, and freedom is to be found in living in recognition of the nature of things. But in some way, every ideology since the Enlightenment has failed in this basic observation because of a rejection of the harmony that is to be found between the natural individual and the natural community. Paine did so, first and foremost, by detaching the individual from his natural proclivity to seek fulfillment in the community and rejecting the natural community as a result. Marx did so, first and foremost, by redefining the community from a group that naturally sprouts from individual association through culture and tradition to a group that ought first and foremost to be defined by its economic status. And so in Marx's analysis, the natural community had to be cut into pieces according to levels of income or economic status, and that these pieces had to become the new nexus on which group identity had to be shaped. And so, where the Western tradition has always held that within a community, you would naturally find some people who are more wealthy and some people who are less wealthy, because people naturally have different personalities, proclivities, and talents. Marx identifies this as a fundamental problem with the world, and one that had to be corrected. And let me interject here to underline that in as far as the conservative view is that it is natural to find some people who are more wealthy and some who are less wealthy within a community, the conservative view is not that this is something to be celebrated, but that this is something to be recognized. It is not, in other words, that we ought to be happy when some people have less than others, but that we ought to recognize that inequality of outcome is a natural consequence of the fact that people are not clones, but that every person is unique in his or her own way. Marx, however, rejected the Western tradition by disregarding individual agency and developing a theory on how to construct a better world. Once again, one that would take us from how things are to how things ought to be. So what Marx and Paine have in common is that they both broke from the Western tradition in their understanding of the nature of the individual and the community. But they did so in fundamentally different ways, leading to contradictory ideologies. Paine did so by regarding the consequences of communal agency as a threat to his conception of the individual, while Marx did so by regarding the consequences of individual agency as a threat to his conception of the community. They were able to do this, first and foremost, by detaching the individual, in Paine's case, and the community, in Marx's case, from its natural characteristics, by redefining what it is and using this new conception as the basis on which their ideologies were shaped. I believe that I've explained sufficiently that when conservatives say that there is not a big difference between how things are and how things ought to be, that this is a reference to how things naturally are, and not some of the problems I mentioned in the beginning. The conservative idea recognizes that we are sinful by nature, and that it is outside the scope of human possibility to become perfected beings, or to change the nature of things. As a result, the conservative idea teaches that we ought to fight what is wrong with the world and pursue what is good within the ambit of these realities. This is why the conservative idea holds that much of what is wrong with the world is not just the result of bad ideas put forth by other ideologies, but of ideology in principle. The problem is ideology before it is bad ideology. It is because the advent of ideologies, of theories that reject the nature of things and seek to create a better world through the futile attempt of changing the nature of things, that the world has taken a particular shape and form, and that the shape and form of the modern world is in many ways the source of our troubles. This is not to say that the world would be some utopia if it weren't for the rise of modern ideologies, that there wouldn't be hardship and so forth, but that if we truly want to make the world a better place, the only way to achieve this is to recognize and appreciate things as they are and to stop waging war on basic truths. The conservative idea holds that we have to fight against sin because we promote what is good when we fight against sin. But it also holds that we should recognize that we do not have the capacity to win this war alone, that it is only through God that we can win the war against sin and evil. And so, if you are not religious, surely you can still be conservative, but then at least you have to appreciate the very fundamental role that religion has played in shaping our cultures and traditions, and that waging war on religion is just another way of waging war on the nature of things. The conservative idea holds that we should be cautious of political theories that seek to change the world. Theory is not bad by definition. We all need to learn theory. And so the conservative idea is not against theory in principle, but against theory that has been contaminated by ideology. And so the conservative answer to the contamination of theory is to maintain an appreciation for theory, but to always ensure that our theories are tested and shaped by experience in the real world. And herein lies the major flaw of the ideologues of the French Revolution, according to Edmund Burke. It was a rejection of common sense based on real life experience, and an attempt to fill the void with abstract ideological theories on how to create a better world. This is why Burke declared in his reflections on the revolution in France that if all the absurd theories of lawyers and divines were to vitiate the objects in which they are conversant, we should have no law and no religion left in the world. but an absurd theory on one side of a question forms no justification for alleging a false fact or promulgating mischievous maxims on the other. He went on to say to the ideologues of his time that while they might have proclaimed that they were combating prejudice, the truth behind the veil was that they were at war with nature. The result was that their so-called liberty was not liberal, that their so-called science was presumptuous ignorance, and that their so-called humanity was savage and brutal. To those who proclaimed that the remnants of the past had to be torn down in order to create a better new world based on a contract between individuals, Burke replied that society could indeed be described as a contract, but not merely a contract between those of us who are living today based on some ideological theory. If we had to think of society as a contract, it is, in Burke's words, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection, a partnership not between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are not yet born. And herein lies the essence of the conservative idea once again. It is a recognition that we are but small in comparison to our ancestors, whose great deeds have left behind great things that we enjoy today, but also that we are small in comparison to our descendants, with regard to which we pray that their great deeds will one day outshadow our own. This is why we are conservative. We are conservative because we appreciate the nature of things, because we recognize that there are some things that we cannot understand and we cannot change, because we value beauty and goodness in a world of imperfection, because we appreciate and respect culture and tradition, not just because we wish to enjoy the fruits thereof, but because we also find fulfillment in contributing to the preservation and the blossoming of culture and tradition. Because we are grateful for what we have inherited, and because we seek to contribute to these things that are much bigger than our own individualistic selves. Because our contribution to these things flows from our recognition that the world doesn't revolve around us. Because we know that we do not deserve, through our own efforts, the tangible and non-tangible things that we have inherited. And because we accept that there is a moral duty on us to be actively involved in our communities, to leave something behind for those who have not yet been born, just as those who have already passed away did for us. Because we believe that fulfilling our responsibilities to our families and our communities is both more important and more lasting than to merely demand for the expansion of individual rights. We are conservative because we believe that the only sustainable definition of freedom is one in which both the individual and the community is recognized and respected, and that there is harmony to be found between the wishes of the community and the choices of the individual. Because we reject the type of groupthink that wages war on individual agency, while we also reject the type of individualism that wages war on reality. Because we recognize that building community institutions and being involved with these institutions is a much more meaningful activity than demanding of the government to fix our problems on our behalf. We are conservative because we believe in mutual recognition and respect between communities, because we foster peaceful coexistence, and because even though we are sometimes forced to fight for the preservation of these things, our decisions, our activities, and our actions are first and foremost shaped by love, not pride or some self-centered love at the expense of others. Love for our families, love for our friends, love for our communities, love for what is true, love for what is good, and love for what is beautiful. It is this love for what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful, and the gratitude that we experience as a result thereof that shapes our sense of being, thrusts us into action, and propels us forward. Hi, I'm Adam Strutz. If you support this podcast and the work that we are involved with as the Afrikaner Foundation and the broader solidarity movement in South Africa, I want to encourage you to become a more active supporter. You can do this first and foremost by subscribing to our various social media channels, by leaving a comment and sharing what you have seen. But other than that, also by making a small monthly contribution to the work that we are doing through the Afrikaner Foundation's website, or by making a once-off donation. Links in the description.